consent. And the other thing to say is that please, if you've got questions, and it would be great to have those, if you could post those into chat, and unless they're about the tech, we'll plan to pick those up at the end of the session. So we are planning to talk to you for about 30 minutes and then have lots of time for questions and a bit of discussion at the end. Great then, so let's crack on.
And we will start by sharing our screen, if that's okay with everybody. I'm going to switch off the thing in the middle.
You were starting.
I can't remember who was starting. So look, the one thing we're not actually going to talk about today is the climate emergency. You all know as well as we do what we face. We've been talking about it now for 30 years. It's 30 years since I first did training in climate literacy, and we know it's going to change everything we do. It's going to change how we work, how we live, how we travel, and it's going to change what we do in our museums and galleries and in the rest of the cultural sector as well. And we all know, we don't need to labour the point too much, what a small window we have to make a real difference to our buildings and our work now. We're facing decarbonisation targets from the government. We're facing, if we can't work out within culture how to make ourselves sustainable quickly, we'll be facing legislation and so on coming down the pipeline. But of course, massively, the biggest milestone, the biggest pressure on time here is coming from the planet itself, and the need that all of us, I think, in culture feel to do what we can to make our sector as sustainable as it can possibly be. We know too, of course, that the climate crisis is mostly falling on people who are much less able than we are to deal with its impacts. All of that explains the background to the Green Book Initiative for Sustainability in Culture. And although most of what we're going to do today is going to be focusing sometimes quite technically on how we make museums and gallery buildings more sustainable, we did want to start just by giving you some background to the Green Book Initiative as a whole, because it explains a good bit of the way in which the guidance and the standards are formulated. So it's an initiative which started during lockdown. It was one of those sort of COVID silver linings of however miserable it was for everybody across culture. It did enable us to have conversations that normally all of us are far too busy to have. And it began in the theatre and performance sectors when we came together on Zoom to just talk about why is it that although our experience is most of us, if not everyone within the cultural sector, is keen for us to be more sustainable. None of us want a sector which damages the planet. And yet we were finding it really hard to make progress. So we set out to say, okay, what are we not doing? What are we not seeing? How do we need to behave differently to give ourselves the guidance, the standard, the momentum we need in order to move our sector towards sustainability?
And what we realised very quickly was that to make progress, we needed to work collectively. Like the museums and galleries sector, the theatre sector it covers a wide range of sizes of organisations and organisations with different focus. And we knew that to have power, we wanted to work collectively and draw together all that expertise.
The second thing I think we put our finger on is that the guidance that we provided really has to be pragmatic. It's really difficult for people working in culture, even people with specific expertise working with buildings, to look at a target like we have to reduce our carbon emissions by 10% a year or by X by the year 2030, and know what that means, know how that tells you where to start or what to do next. not least because a lot of people in the museum and gallery and indeed at the time in the theatre sector are working very hard in smaller organisations. Many companies don't have specialist expertise that can focus on particular targets or particular subjects. So we knew the guidance had to be really clear, really step by step, and really pragmatic. So instead of that question, we set out to say, okay, practically, what can we do next? And the way we created the Green Book, and it's been exactly the same with the Arts Green Book, has been to get people just like yourselves, and some of you haven't looked down the participants list, but some of you, I'm sure, were in our focus groups, into focus groups, together with our sustainability experts, Bura Happold, who are a big, both do building engineering, but also have a fantastic international sustainability unit. And they, as it were, underwrote everything that went into the guidance. Now, what that means, we hope, is that everything in the Arts Green Book that you might be using, and indeed in the rest of the Theatre Green Book, is both realistic about the challenges that you all face, but is also underpinned by sustainability expertise so that you can be sure it really is giving us the answers, the priorities, the steps we need to take to make our buildings and our other work sustainable.
And then the third thing that was important for everybody was that it was methodical. As we know, there's a lot of guidance out there already. Some of you are chief executives, some of you are working within, have responsibility just for buildings, some people are funders. And what we recognised was that it is much easier if across an organisation, people can see how everyone is working together to make their organisation more sustainable. And with that in mind, in the world of theatre, we recognised that we needed to break down the 3 volumes as between the work that was on the stage, the buildings, and then finally the operations, which was, as you can see there, the marketing, the ticketing, the waste, and the catering and the front of house. And that by having a set of guidance and standards in each of those 3 volumes, a whole organisation could progress towards sustainability. And there you go, the 3 volumes as we define them. And those 3 volumes are now sitting on the website, the Theatre Green Book. It's translated into other languages as well.
And it's probably important to say at this point, 2 things, both that everything in the Green Book is completely free to use. You can download it and use it for free. And we hope it's self-explanatory. And the other thing is that even though with the Arts Green Book, we've only developed the buildings volume to cover all cultural sectors, many of you are likely to find within the Theatre Green Book things that are going to be useful for you in terms of running your operation, of travel and waste, of marketing and box office, if you do bring the public into your building or whatever it might be. But the Arts Green Book is now on the website artsgreenbook.com. Again, it's completely free to use, and in it you'll find a buildings volume that we hope will give you everything you need to know to take your building and make it sustainable. The one thing it doesn't contain is money, unfortunately, and we'll talk about that later because we know that's the big issue. That's the elephant in the room, if you like, and we will come back to it. But there's a lot we can do without money in terms of working out what is the plan, what do we need to do to make our buildings sustainable, and to start to tackle some of the cheaper, easy wins. We'll talk about that in a minute, which can start to move you towards sustainability. So if you open up the Arts Green Book, and some of you may have had a look at it already, you'll find there a number of things. First, at a glance, and I'm going to go through this in a little bit of detail, and it will tell you what you need to do to make a building sustainable. And the thing I'd really want to stress is that we do know the answers. there are some aspects of sustainability in culture where we are having to invent new ways of doing things. But with buildings, and I say this as an architect who's been working on cultural buildings for 30 years, we do know exactly what we need to do and in what order to make a building sustainable. One of the origins of the Theatre Green Book for buildings was that I found myself as an architect writing master plans for cultural buildings up and down the UK, theatres and museums and galleries and others. And with every master plan, we would do a sustainability plan for the building, and it always said pretty much the same thing, depending a bit on the age of the building. But the solutions, the challenges were the same. And we realized that there was no need, that it was a waste of resource for all of you individually to be employing consultants like me to give you this advice, because we could actually codify it and make it clear to you, bust the jargon, write the background to it, explain the priorities, so that the sector as a whole could develop much more quickly and much more cheaply the plans of what we need to do to make all of our cultural building stock fit for purpose in the context of the climate emergency. So those basic principles I'm going to talk through in a minute. We then, in this longer section, unpack them at length, looking at the particular challenges of older and newer buildings, looking at the detail of what we need to do under each area, looking at the different building types. And we've got a couple of pages on museums and galleries that I'll come to a little bit later. And then looking at the process of putting together a maintenance program, of how you deal with the fact that there will be other things happening to your building that you need to tackle at the same time, simple maintenance needs or development needs that you need to dovetail with the task of making the building sustainable. And the big challenge of capital projects. Those of you who've been through them know how complex and sometimes bruising they can be. And we've provided whatever guidance we can to help you with that. The aim is to put you as building operators in control of a process that can be very baffling and confusing. It doesn't need to be. The challenge of sustainability in buildings is not rocket science. And I hope that by the end of this seminar, for those of you who aren't familiar with the ideas, it will all seem very much clearer. The guidance itself, it takes the form of what we call a home survey tool. We'll talk about it in more detail later, but basically, armed with what you've read in the rest of the book, you'll be able to log on to a web-based tool, enter some details about your building, not particularly specialist details, and it will then give you, printed out on Excel, a starter for 10 sustainability plan. It won't be the end of the road. It won't tell you everything you need to know. There'll be some things where it suggests that you need to get in professional advice, naturally, where you need some specialist advice on technical issues or on planning permission, for instance. But we can identify those. We can say what's appropriate for your building and put it in order of importance. Finally, and we'll come to this at the end, there's a toolkit where people, many of them working in the industry like yourselves, have brought together experience and knowledge, which hopefully will make the journey somewhat easier for all of us. So how do we, let's take any cultural building, any museum or gallery, because the principles are going to be the same for all of them, and how do we make it sustainable? And we know, thanks to the input of our sustainability experts who've been able to crunch numbers and have been working with data and building physics for a long time now, the order in which we need to tackle the challenge of making a building sustainable. And the first thing we need to do to any building to make it more sustainable is to make it need less energy in the first place, or be lean in the jargon, in the sustainability jargon that we're using. If the building needs less energy, then of course it will be greener. Now, the thing that uses most energy for most buildings is about heating and cooling, not very surprisingly. So to make the building need less energy is all about insulation. insulating roofs, insulating walls, double or second or triply glazing windows, putting lobbies on entrance doors so that you don't lose heat every time the door gets opened, insulating the building as if you were wrapping a duvet all the way around it to prevent heat from being lost. That, the numbers show, is the single most important thing we can do to make a building more efficient, to make it need less energy in the first place. Now, sometimes that's easy to do. Flat roofs on mid-century buildings are fairly easy to insulate over the top at the time you replace the roof. It's not cheap, but it's not particularly disruptive to do. Putting secondary glazing on windows is fairly straightforward to do, but of course we know, and particularly for any of you who occupy historic buildings, that it's much easier to say some of these things than to do them. If you have elaborate rooms with cornices and mouldings, insulating the walls can be very hard to do. If you've got a historic building whose facades are listed or of historic significance, you can't insulate them on the outside either. So we know that with historic buildings, it's hard to do this perfectly, but nearly always there are some ways in which you can reduce the amount of energy you're losing in the first place. And the other reason why it's important to do that is that unless you take this step first, some of the other sustainability measures that we'll talk about in a minute won't work properly because the building won't be efficient enough. So that's the first thing to do. An awful lot of people who we talk to, when you talk about sustainability in buildings, the first thing they go to is photovoltaic cells or some other obviously green measure. But those don't come first. The first thing to do is to try and make sure you're using less energy before you even start. The second thing to do in terms of priority is to make the building, is to look in turn at each of the systems in the building which do use energy and make them use less. So what are those systems? Well, heating and cooling will probably come top. Ventilation will be very high. Hot water for staff showers or for public toilets will be somewhere in there. Lighting will certainly, for museums and galleries, be a major element. And then there'll be other systems, whether it's lifts, or if you've got a restaurant, the kitchen, or in your offices, the lighting, the computers, the printers, and so on. You can all think through for yourselves and perhaps make a list of all of the systems in the building that use energy of any sort, whether it's electricity or whether it's gas in the boiler or oil or whatever. And the challenge then is to make them use less. Now, there are two ways we can do that. The first and most obvious way is to replace old systems with new, more efficient ones. Now, that might mean replacing lighting, old tungsten or halogen lighting, which uses a lot of energy, with LED lights that use less energy to make the same amount of light. Or it may mean replacing your 40-year-old boilers, which are very inefficient, with more efficient boilers, which will produce the same amount of energy in terms of kilowatts, kilowatt hours, for much less fuel, much less carbon use or energy use. So that's one way in which you can think through your systems and work out how you can replace the plant, replace the kit itself, the equipment which uses the energy. And that goes all the way down to the fridge in your staff kitchen, where you might be able to replace it with a more modern, of course it won't have a big impact, but it's all worth thinking about with a more modern, more efficient fridge. Now, some of those things are going to be really expensive and long-term. Replacing your boilers is going to be a big job, for instance. So the other way in which we can make your building use less energy is to look at the controls. Because let's say you've got old-fashioned lights and you can't afford to replace them yet, all the way along your top floor. If they're on less often, and if fewer of them on, then of course you're using less energy. So with the controls, what we're looking at is, are you lighting rooms in which nobody's there? Are you heating a whole floor when actually only one meeting room's being used? Have you got lights on in galleries before the public goes in, or staying on at night afterwards? And then, of course, can you use less light? Can you make sure that if you've got a big open plan office, the light comes on only in sections to suit where there are people, using movement detectors? Can you reduce the temperature in the galleries? That's something which we know some museums and galleries have done. And of course, that's a way of controlling the energy you're using so that you use less of it. The principle is really simple. And once you think through system by system, everything that uses power, you'll be able to start to see ways in which you can reduce how much power it draws. Some of that is simply by physical controls, if you don't have the money to invest in anything else, or it's a matter of putting in systems that will do it automatically. For example, by splitting your heating system into zones so that they come on room by room, by putting thermostatic valves on your radiators, by putting movement detectors on your lights. Those things do cost money, but they're not that expensive. And of course, in the context of the energy cost crisis, you'll get that money back now much more quickly than you would have done a couple of years ago. And if there is a silver lining in the energy cost crisis, that's it. For those of you who have already what's called a building management system, which is a sophisticated computer controller that runs all of your systems, the question becomes, are you using it as efficiently as you could? We're aware that a lot of organizations have quite clever systems, but a bit of training, a bit of reprogramming would enable them to cut energy use. Now, we don't have really hard data at the moment of how much we can win by those sorts of controls. But our sense is, and there has been a little bit more evidence-based work done in Germany, that actually it can be as much as 25% of your overall energy use can be cut by looking at those kind of easy wins. Of course, that won't apply to all organizations, but it's surprising how much you can start to cut if you're really rigorous about it before you start getting into the challenge of big capital investment. So first, we've made the building need less energy, then we've made it use less energy. The third, and only the third thing to do, is to see if we can generate energy in and around the building itself. And that, of course, takes us to things like solar panels. Most of you will know there's two types. Literally thermal panels, which heat up water so that you're putting less energy into heating the water up to the temperature you need it at. But what's much more common these days is photovoltaic cells that directly generate electricity. Heat pumps, most of you will have heard about or read about. Some of you, I'm sure, have already got them installed in your buildings. They generate energy out of temperature differentials. They're not zero carbon because they need pumps, which are driven by electricity, but the actual heat or cool sources, a bit like a fridge, they're creating by heat transfer between areas that have heat differential. There's really two sorts, either out in the air, working on the differences in air temperature, or ground source heat pumps, where you're boring into the ground to use the temperature of the ground to drive the energy transfer. Now, they're not quite the magic solution that the press sometimes suggests. You know, rip out your gas boiler and put in a heat pump and Bob's your uncle. It's not, the reason for that is that they work at a much lower temperature than fossil fuel boilers do. And therefore, unless you first insulated your building so that you're not losing too much energy, they're not likely to work that well. And you can't always, sometimes, but not always, plug them into old radiator systems because the water won't be hot enough to give you the heat you need. But certainly they're part of the future. Certainly if you're doing a major refurbishment, they'll be one of the first things that you'll be thinking about and that your consultants will be talking about. Wind turbines don't apply to many cultural buildings out in the country, but we do know some that have managed to put them up. And then finally, the national grid, which in the UK is increasingly green because so much of it is now coming from offshore wind. Now, that feels as if, you know, there's your answer, just make everything electric and you've got a zero carbon building. And one of these days that might be true. But it's not true yet. There's still a lot of other power sources going into the grid. And also, we know that as we switch to electric for transport through electric cars and so on, that we're going to be drawing more from the grid. So it's still valuable and important to look for opportunities to generate your own energy on site wherever you can. The final one, point 6 on the screen there, is about local networks to help you buy energy efficiently. Some of you, particularly if you're in local authority owned buildings, may be able to connect with other energy networks to make sure, for example, that you're buying clean energy, certifiable clean energy off the grid at the sort of costs that aren't too frightening. Now, the crisis we're facing is, of course, an energy crisis, but it's also a crisis of biodiversity. And we mustn't forget, and this is the fourth of the real principles on which sustainable buildings are based, that we need to support biodiversity wherever we can. And in cities, that's particularly important in order to create green corridors, particularly for insect life, across urban and built-up areas. So it's pretty obvious what that means. Green roofs on flat roofs here and there, planting around your landscape if you have space around you, and reclaiming water where you can. Mostly that's the rainwater, and it might be as simple as a traditional rainwater butt that you use for irrigation of your planting. There are more complicated systems where you reclaim water from showers and so on to use them in toilets. It's not impossible. We normally find that that's a more elaborate, more expensive, more difficult to install than works for most cultural systems, but you will hear people talking about it. That then gives you the order of priorities for your building, and you can see pretty much straight away that some things will apply to your buildings and some of them won't. If you use the home survey tool, it will take you through that step by step. So the next step is to take all of that knowledge and turn it into a plan of action for you to carry out. Now, I'm going to skip through those slides and come back to them. Oh, I'm missing a couple of slides. Sorry about that. The key thing here is that, of course, you can't do everything all at once. There's going to be easy stuff you could do tomorrow, but there's going to be stuff that all of you will be looking at it, new boilers, whatever it might be, and saying, well, hang on, that's 5 years of fundraising and planning permission, and there's lots of other stuff we need to do to the building as well. So the next step, and the home survey tool will do this automatically, is to take everything that applies to your building and triage it. And we triage it into 3 sections. Easy wins that won't cost much, and you can do them straight away, or certainly quickly. Maintenance projects, which you could plan into your annual maintenance. And an example of that might be gradually, floor by floor, putting secondary glazing on your offices, or gradually, room by room, replacing lighting with LED. That could be planned into your maintenance programs. And then thirdly, capital projects. And we know those are more challenging. They'll involve fundraising, they'll involve listed building and planning consents, and so on. But within each of those categories, easy wins, maintenance projects, and capital projects, we'll set out the actions that sit within each category in order of importance, starting with anything that helps your building need less energy, be lean, moving on to anything that helps it use less energy, be clean, and then moving on to being green, anything that will help it generate energy. And that way you've got a plan. It contains everything your building needs to make it as sustainable as it can be. It divides it into easy wins, maintenance projects, and capital projects. And under each heading, it sets it out in order of the impact it will have in making your building more sustainable. Now, when you use the home survey tool and go through it, of course, there'll be things where you don't have the knowledge to make a decision and you need specialist advice. Is your building suitable for a heat pump? Would we get planning permission to put photovoltaics on that roof slope? And what the home survey tool will do will flag those up and say, okay, this is who you need to talk to. You need to get an architect in. You need to get an engineer in. but it will give you an idea of the scope of the challenge. It will get you going, it will get you moving on the easy wins, and it will put you in control of the conversation you have with specialists when the time does come to start drawing them in. Now, I'm going to move a bit quicker so we do have time for some questions at the end. But in the Arts Green Book, you'll also find a couple of pages that are flagging up some of the specific challenges that we know apply to museums and galleries. And we know about them because we did a couple of really, really helpful focus groups where ourselves and our sustainability partners and groups of people like yourselves from museums and galleries of different scales all over the country came in to tell us about what's specific about the challenges you face. And we've gathered some of them together now. And I'm gonna hurry them through a bit because you can go back to them yourselves. But the ones that seem to jump out that we're really aware of that can be a real challenge for museum and gallery operators are firstly climate parameters for humidity and temperature, which will be to do with your displays and the often precious or fragile objects that you have within them. The challenge of very large gallery spaces, which at certain times of day might have quite variable occupancy. They won't all be full all of the time. And with older heating systems, you might be heating an awful lot of area for not many people. Many of you might have a large storage need and are very likely to be using buildings which weren't purpose-built for storage. And so you're having to pump a lot of energy into them to keep them at the temperature and humidity levels that you need. Many of you we found are part of quite complex and challenging estates where there's a kind of three-dimensional challenge in looking at the sustainability need for a lot of different buildings at once, as well as the Jenga of moving collections around to free up different areas for refurbishment. And others of you we know are also operating spaces where you're on short leases and it's not up to you. You don't have the power to make major investments. So you can only focus on the easy wins. Climate parameters, we know there are conversations within the sector about whether the parameters always need to be as tight as they are. That can only go a certain way. Of course, there are objects which do need to be protected, but that may allow for some relaxation. But certainly asking yourselves whether the parameters you've got of temperature and humidity for all of your display and storage spaces are the right ones is a useful, we're told, is a useful exercise to go through, and gathering data is useful. And there can be other solutions like looking at whether you're controlling large spaces for a small number of objects, or whether you could corral the more fragile objects into smaller spaces so that you're putting less energy into preserving them. That won't apply to everybody, but for some of you that could provide solutions. When it comes to gallery space, reviewing what are called set points, which is what are the standard temperatures you're heating to. We had a meeting not that long ago with the Football Museum in Manchester, and they're not the only ones who have gradually brought their temperatures down by a couple of degrees with nobody commenting on it or noticing. The public, this doesn't necessarily apply to your offices, but the public going around museums and galleries are often keeping their coats on and don't necessarily have to be kept to domestic temperatures. You'll have to decide for yourselves and your visitors what will work, but plenty of museums and galleries have looked at that. And then, of course, where possible, you want to be heating people, not empty space. In a big gallery space, wherever you can, to provide the heat sources low down will mean that much less energy is needed. Storage need, consolidating it into fewer buildings if you can, and where you can, using buildings where you're not having to pump energy into them to keep them at decent temperatures. I've worked with museum and gallery clients who, for historic reasons, have had to store objects in really unsuitable buildings, and the only way to keep the objects safe is by pumping in energy. So long-term thinking about whether your buildings are appropriate is a really important part of this. There's some notes here which I won't go into in detail on managing estates, And there are also some opportunities, particularly if you're part of a local authority portfolio, or you have other networks which you might be able to draw from.
So if you're all still with us, yeah, we talked about the home survey tool, which is there on the website. I think just to reiterate at this point, actually, that this is free for anyone to access. So please do spread the word and use it, and all of it is free. You won't suddenly find that to move to another level of guidance that you suddenly have to pay a subscription or to engage a particular commercial practice. This is all here for you to use. And also, as we were saying, there are toolkit pages which have been contributed by people working in the museums and galleries sectors, which will also help you draw on advice that others have found helpful, and so that collectively we can all try and address this challenge. And as we said before, to the two websites, the Theatre Green Book, which you may find helpful because it gives operational guidance in there as well, and then the Arts Green Book, within which you'll find the buildings volume that we've just been talking about. Any feedback, questions, there's the email address for that as well.
So let's stop sharing at that point. And let's have a look in the chat. And should we just take these one at time? Is there an etiquette for asking questions? Yes, Fiona. Yes, put them in the chat. That's absolutely fine. And we do have a recording for anybody who did miss the beginning. So we've heard a lot about gas boilers being outlawed for new build homes for 2025. In due course, there is likely to be a complete ban, yes, on fossil fuel boilers. It's likely to come in quite slowly. The viable replacement for gas boilers is the heat pump, but as I think I said as we were going through it, it's not a like-for-like replacement. So there's a lot of prior investment needed to make heat pumps viable, and of course you need a certain amount of space for them, both inside and outside, to make them work. So you need professional advice to work out whether a heat pump is the right answer. I think it's important to be pragmatic. Yes, we do all need to get to net zero, but there's no doubt that new gas boilers are far, far more efficient in terms of energy use than very old oil or gas boilers. And for some people, that is going to be the right answer right now, is going to be to put in the most efficient gas boiler you can and plan for a change to heat pumps, because heat pumps will, of course, become more efficient and easy to use over time, to plan to do that in 5 or 10 years' time. Humidifiers on their last legs. So looking at the carbon footprints of replacement humidifiers, I don't think we've got any conclusive, we've got any specific one manufacturer is better than another advice on humidifiers. We can punch that towards our engineering partner as a question. If you wouldn't mind sending that in as a question by email, we can forward it to our sustainability engineering partners to see if they have an answer on it. But you touch in the question on something really important, which is whenever you're buying new equipment, to make sure that sustainability and efficiency is one of the criteria, whether that's humidifiers or projectors or fridges or whatever it might be. Attempting to resolve a low humidity issue with commercial window fill and secondary glazing products, which claim to contribute to environmental performance and energy efficiency. Yeah, the answer is secondary glazing can be efficient. It's not as efficient as a brand new window, but in heritage buildings, that's not possible. And so secondary glazing is a lot cheaper. But yes, a good secondary glazing system will certainly be very efficient in terms of improving energy. What you do need to steer clear of is you do come across a few sort of wonder products. I've seen insulating wallpaper advertised. And believe me, it is not what it says on the tin. You don't get something for nothing. Insulation, even efficient insulation, needs to have a certain thickness to do anything. So there's a bit of snake oil out there. But yes, secondary glazing is certainly a strong, good, bona fide product. Make sure you get good quality secondary glazing.
Oh, and Deborah's come up with an answer, I think.
Oh, great. That's really helpful. Brilliant. That sounds... Oh, maybe not. Great. And then, we missed one. Many cultural organisations are leased premises, often from a local authority, but also private landlords. Who's the problem holder solver when it comes to making the material needed to make the energy saving measures needed for a more sustainable future? And that's true of many sectors, of cultural sectors, that people are typically on very, very short leases. If you find that yourself in that situation, then of course you're not in the world where you're going to be doing the large and expensive capital projects. Your lease wouldn't allow you to do it in the first place. So you want to focus on the easy wins. And nearly always that's going to be about controls. Those can simply be physical staff procedures, making sure that lights are out, making sure that temperature is switched down, and so on. Or they can be more mechanical than that. When it comes to persuading landlords to do more, if you can find the time and energy and commitment, it can be really helpful to do the home survey tool, to do a sustainability plan for the building, and then share it with the landlord. So that even if you're not going to take responsibility, you can't take responsibility for doing the work, you can bring it to their attention and hopefully persuade them to do something. One sort of key question in all of this is who pays the energy bills. Some people are on leases where the energy bill is part of the rent, and sometimes you're responsible for it. If you are responsible for it, then you probably have more power and leverage in making decisions about improving the building. Could we have a point where for a heritage building it would be so expensive and interventionist to make the necessary changes to meet net zero? Well, half of that question, I think the answer is yes. It's not necessarily possible to make a heritage building zero carbon in the sense that it will use no energy. You can always, of course, make it net zero in terms of if you get into carbon offsetting, which we tend not to recommend because it's a real minefield, and because we want the energy, we all want the energy to be going into doing everything we possibly can to reduce energy use. That's where our energy needs to go. Somewhere in the future, and really there's no point spending too much time worrying about it for now, is a question none of us can control, which is how successfully the national grid decarbonizes. In an optimist version of life, or indeed in France, where the grid is incredibly green because it's nuclear, you can have quite inefficient buildings and still keep them comfortable by putting in huge amounts of energy, which might be green. And in a sense, that's a zero carbon building. We're not there yet, or even particularly close to it with the UK, and we don't know how close we're going to get to it. The phrase that I think we wouldn't want to trip over in the question, I guess, is fit for purpose, because who's to judge whether the building is just serving a functional purpose as a museum or gallery, or whether it's also serving a social, community and landscape purpose as a heritage building? And that's another kind of minefield that I wouldn't want to get into. I think our advice would always be, look, there's lots we can be doing to get on with it. We can be making our plans, we can be doing all the things we can do, and let's worry about some of these final details when we're an awful lot closer to that end point than we are now.
Yes, and it strikes me, having worked in a very large building where there was no money for capital, actually the risk is that you feel you can't do anything. And by going back to that idea of changing controls, one can make a really meaningful difference in saving energy. So this was the National Theatre. and by putting in variable controls around the place and drawing on people's ingenuity, also engaging the staff. We managed to save 25% of our energy footprint, which was meaningful. And of course, as we were saying earlier, right now, this really translates into cash as well.
We're 2 minutes over time, but really important to pick up Trevor's comment in the chat, because this, I think we called it the elephant in the room early on. At the end of the day, the big capital projects on our museums and galleries and other cultural buildings, concert halls and whatever, is a huge bill facing this country. In the theatre sector, the Theatres Trust did some really good evidence-based calculations on what it will cost to make Britain's theatres sustainable. We know that in the museums and galleries, there's a similar plan going on at the moment. We know the cinema sector is looking at that too. What we hope people will do is start to get a holistic sense of what the financial challenge really looks like for making our cultural buildings fit for purpose in the context of the climate emergency. We know already, just from looking at one or two sectors, that the numbers go massively beyond any amount that any recent government has ever invested in cultural buildings, and far, far, far beyond anything that the usual philanthropic funds and trusts that put money into capital projects are able to cover. So it's a vast challenge. It's most unlikely, honestly, I think, that any political party is going to sign a check for the literally billions of pounds needed to do this. In Germany, they're in a very different place. They invest much more in culture, and what we discovered on a very recent trip around German cultural buildings is that very many of them are literally owned by the city or state or government, who therefore have direct responsibility for them. That's less, other than some local authority owned buildings, that's less the case here. So there is good lobbying going on. It's great to hear what you're doing at Culture Commons, and it'd be great to join up with others about that. But the first step, we think, or the step that's already underway, is trying to evaluate what sort of numbers we're talking about, while also really fostering whatever good political conversations anyone is able to start.
Well, thanks everybody very much for joining us. I think we should close it there, and good luck with your buildings. As I say, info@artsgreenbook.com for any further queries.
And thanks very much for joining us, all of you.
Bye.